today we're going to talk about background concepts for understanding Buddhism and for reading the Dhammapada. So just some kind of background information on how Buddhism was founded. It was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who is basically referred to as the Buddha, which means enlightened one. Now, Siddhartha had a really interesting kind of lived experience. If maybe you've read the book Siddhartha, but if not, I highly recommend reading it. It's about his life and how he came closer to achieving enlightenment and nirvana. And so Siddhartha was born into an upper caste family, basically a royal family. He was a prince in India, which is now known as Nepal. And so when he was out, he saw death, he saw old age, and he saw sickness. And so he realized, wow, like this is terrible, right? So many people are suffering, yet I'm not suffering, because he had so much wealth and he had so much privilege. And so his father protected him from everything and gave him everything he wanted because he didn't want Siddhartha to leave the privileged life he had. But Siddhartha didn't listen, and so he left and went on his own journey towards enlightenment, towards trying to figure out how do we overcome suffering, because it's terrible that so many people are suffering, right? How can we transcend this? How can we try to help people experience more happiness and nourishment in their lives? And so he went through different kinds of extremes when it came to his path towards enlightenment. And one of the extremes that he went through was that of asceticism. So at the time that Siddhartha was living, there were these people called ascetics who sat underneath a tree, meditated all day for 24 hours, and they starved themselves and they weren't drinking water. And so Siddhartha tried that out and he almost died, and he said, no, this is not helping me achieve enlightenment. This isn't going to help people achieve enlightenment. There has to be something a little bit more moderate than this, right? Because he also experienced decadence and pleasure and hedonism. But then he needed to find something that was a little bit more, in between these two extremes, right? And this is how he came up with the middle path. And through his meditation, he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, and he realized that there are these four noble truths to overcome suffering. And so what are these four noble truths? Well, there's a first truth of suffering, the fact that it exists and that it's inevitable, right? We all get old, we all get sick, and we all die. It's kind of, in a weird way, right, the great equalizer for everyone in society. But this is just the truth of reality. We all suffer. The second noble truth is that there's a cause to the suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, which has to do with our desire and ignorance. So desire and ignorance is such a lethal combination, but desire has to do with the fact that we desire impermanence, and we desire objects, we desire people, we desire relationships, and we can't control everything. And that drives us crazy, right? We can't control these things that impacts us in our lives. So part of this idea of desire is trying to learn this notion of impermanence, that everything changes constantly, and that we can't act upon our ignorance. So like I said, desire and ignorance cause suffering. How does ignorance cause suffering? Well, we make choices based off of incorrect or incomplete information. And so that is what leads to so many of the evils in the world, right? When we think about prejudice and racism and xenophobia and all of these terrible isms that exist. So the third noble truth, though, is that, whoa, now that we know that the cause of suffering, how can we overcome suffering, right? How can we try to achieve something to end suffering? So the third noble truth is the truth of the end of suffering, the fact that there is an end to suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the pathway to the end of suffering, which is referred to as the Eightfold Path. Now, the Eightfold Path is a series of steps and pathways, right steps, right pathways. So the right steps have to do with embodying certain correct ways of doing things, right concentration, right thought, right action, because our thoughts and our speech and our actions are all connected to one another. So we have to be able to control our thoughts in order to achieve enlightenment. And I'm sure if you've gone to a yoga class or meditation class or even done one of the many meditation apps that exist, they always say, it's okay if you can't completely concentrate. Just recognize it, acknowledge it, and then move on. Right? So that's part of this notion of the right steps. And the right pathways have to do with right behavior, right conduct, being compassionate, caring about other people, being mindful, right? So being able to really concentrate on the moment. recognize that I can't control other people. I can't control the society, everything about the society I live in, but I can control how I react to these circumstances. So we want to feel omnipotent, we want to feel powerful, but we aren't. So how do we deal with this? And that's where the right pathways come into play here. And with Buddhism, what's kind of exciting about it is that, yes, it is a religion, but it transcends a religion. It's also, I think of it as a philosophy and kind of a lifestyle, because you don't have to believe in a God to be a Buddhist. You don't have to believe in any kind of higher being to be a Buddhist. It's this idea of Buddhahood is something that we all as humans have within us, right? It's a potential that we have, and we just have to kind of unlock that potential. And the core concepts with Buddhism that make someone a Buddhist, I think, have to do with compassionate wisdom and mindfulness, right? So I talked about mindfulness earlier with this idea of being fully present in the moment, not always thinking about, okay, I got to do the laundry later, and I got to cook dinner later, and I got to do this and that, but how can I really embrace being in the moment? And also recognizing through introspection, right, when we have those ill thoughts, when we think ill will, and then compassionate wisdom, which I think is a form of ethical intelligence, right? Because being compassionate is ethical. You're feeling for someone else, you're thinking about someone else. But then the wisdom part has to do with recognizing that we don't know everything and not acting based off of ignorance. So those are kind of the major kind of components of Buddhism that I wanted to focus on. Now, I know that there's a lot of confusion about reincarnation and rebirth in Buddhism, so I wanted to talk about what that entails. So Buddhists don't believe in a self. Unlike in Hinduism, there's a sense of Atman, which means self. In Buddhism, there's a sense of Anatman, which means no self. So what the heck is reincarnated then? If there isn't a self, if there isn't a soul, what's going on here? And this is where karma comes in. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard about the term karma, right? That idea that, every action has a reaction. That's completely correct, but karma doesn't happen as fast as you want it to happen. So what's funny is that sometimes we say, oh, I tipped my barista at the coffee shop today, so someone's going to be nice to me. That's not quite how karma works. It actually happens in a much more long-term gradual way. So for example, if I think I'm engaging in right actions or bad actions, then that's going to impact me after I die. That's going to impact me in my future lives. So what is a good action, or what is a right action? What is a bad action? A good action has to do with actions that bring about happiness in the long term, and a bad action has to do with actions that bring about pain and suffering in the long term. So karma then is determined by the repetitiveness of these kinds of actions, the consistency of it. It also has to do with the intentionality of it. Are you voluntarily acting in this way, or someone making you act in this way? Can you perform it without regret, right? Is this something that you fully thought about, that you knew about, or did you randomly do the right thing? And so that is what all goes into assessing whether someone has acquired good karma or bad karma, and what kind of realm they're born into. Are they born into the human realm where they have the potential for reincarnation? Where they have the potential for enlightenment, right? And Buddhahood and nirvana, which is nothingness? Or are they stuck kind of in this endless cycle of samsara, of suffering, of reincarnation, where they're born into a lower animal who may not necessarily have that ability to achieve enlightenment? So that's kind of how karma goes. And rebirth happens then because it's not a self that is reincarnated. It's a series of cause and effect that's reincarnated. So a way to think about it is like a stream of water that's reincarnated. It's moving, but it has a shapeless form. It's not very substantial. And that's how rebirth happens with Buddhism. I also wanted to mention how when we think about the idea of devotion, right? So many religions have this idea of devotion. With Buddhism, devotion is not necessarily practicing it in one way, right? It's something where one can practice yoga, mindfulness, meditate, be compassionate, right? Eat meat or not eat meat. But the idea is that you are mindful and you are compassionate in overall towards all living beings, but the ways in which we express it can differ. So it is very pluralistic of a religion, where you don't have to believe in a specific thing all the time, but you do have to practice that mindfulness and that compassion. And while Buddhism is a lot more central to cultures in Southeast Asia, it is, spreading throughout the world. It has spread to the West, and it's infused in a lot of yoga practices. If you've gone to yoga classes, it's also infused into apps that people use for going to sleep. There's a lot of apps that are free, like Breathe or Calm, that they talk about like be mindful, think about your day, think about forgiveness, right? Those are all Buddhist concepts. So it is an exciting time to see how Buddhism has been infused into the 21st century Western context.